how's life been treating you?
Really good. I actually have had a bit of a respite this week, not a lot of work, which has let me do some baking, been doing some writing, went on a nice run yesterday, just get some time off to relax.
Nice. No, I think my week is going to be a little bit lighter too. Last week I had some exams, which were kind of brutal, and I work over the weekends, but the middle of the week is normally nicer for me, so yeah, I think I'll get to relax a little bit more.
In terms of the pandemic, cases are going up everywhere.
Pretty much
Previous
everywhere.
spikes in the United States have been localized to New York City or to Florida or other, specific areas. But this current spike is just everywhere. Cases are going up. I've been invited to a Halloween party on Saturday that I'm really excited about. And I'm probably going to go, but I'm definitely feeling guilty about it.
How many people are going to be there?
Not more than 10. But if I was living with people who weren't... My only other roommate is also under 20. Yeah. If I was living with more people, especially people who are older, I don't think I'd be going.
Yeah. No.
To some extent, I'm allowing myself a little bit of irresponsibility now, even if it's not the right choice.
Yeah. I mean, Halloween has just not even been on my radar. It's so different this year. I just haven't even been thinking about it, really.
Yeah. Halloween's a weird holiday anyways. Of all the holidays that we should get rid of, Halloween is, I think, a pretty easy one to choose.
Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Yeah, but it loses a lot of its appeal once you turn 15.
Yeah, I get that. No, I mean, really the only thing on my mind because of Halloween is I'm a peer educator with my university.
Oh.
And so, and we reach out into a couple different areas, but one of them is we talk about substance use. And so the most I've thought about Halloween is like, okay, what programming are we going to do? And it, with this peer education, we've got to do a lot of virtual programming, and it has not gone well. Like we did like this game night where we tried to do like Jackbox games or stuff like that, and one person showed up for 15 minutes. It's just brutal.
Yeah. And on the other side of that, I'm a student. I don't want to go to virtual events. I'm not going to do it. I'm
a peer educator, and I don't go to virtual events. Like, we were having conversations with our group, and we were like, oh, maybe we should do this. And I was just like, would any of you go to this event? And they're like, no. It's like, who do you expect is going to come then? So at this point, it's mostly just to, provide us, it's more that, oh, look, we're doing things even if no one's coming to them. Both for, optics of the higher-ups, but also for, oh, at least we'll kind of have a place in the minds of some of the students, even if they're not actually coming.
That's true. Weird times, man.
Definitely.
So this podcast episode is going to come out on November 3rd, which in the United States is Election Day. It's Election Day. This year in particular, a lot of people are concerned about the election because there are a lot of things that could go wrong, and very wrong, very quickly.
Yes. Oh, and the thing is, it's everyone. I have not talked to a single no one, in person, online, anywhere, nobody who is just zen about this election, who's like, oh, I think that it's going to go perfectly fine. I think, either candidate would work, or the candidate I want, I'm sure they'll get elected. No, everyone is stressed. Everyone is worried both about, which candidate will be elected, but also just, will a candidate be elected, and will it be fair?
The process itself, yeah. And that's not good for democracy.
No.
I was a lot more anxious over the summer. I think recently I've come to a place of peace about it, mostly because there's nothing I can do. Worrying about it isn't going to help.
I'm not in the same boat. I think my concern has been just consistently increasing over time, the closer and closer we get. And not even for candidates, cards on the table. I want Biden to be the next president. Not because I love Biden. I do not. I really wish it was someone else, because he's going in the right direction for the stuff I want. Not exactly what I want, but better than the alternative. And, I do worry that Trump will be reelected, but that is a much, much, much more minor worry than the system breaking. Because if Trump is reelected,
Yes.
By the vote of the people, okay, he's the next president. That's who we voted for. That's what we're going to do. I'm going to be really bummed. I'm going to be sad because I think that it is the wrong choice for our country, and I think it's damaging, but I don't think it's the end of the world. What could be a huge problem is if we end up in a situation where neither of them are credibly elected.
That would be very bad. Like a 2000 election, for example. So maybe we should back up and explain. There's a long timeline between Election Day and inauguration.
Yeah.
So on the first Tuesday in November, Election Day, you individually go and cast your ballot in your state for a number of things. Then a whole month later, I believe it is December 6th, the state legislatures all get together and use the popular vote tallies from a month previously to elect electoral college electors, who they will then, later on in December, those electoral college electors will convene in the state capitals, cast their vote for a presidential candidate, and send those votes to the United States Congress. Electoral votes are counted in the House of Representatives on January 6th of the next year. And following that, Inauguration Day is like January 20th.
And it is very, very, very much enshrined that no matter what, the current president's term ends that day, no matter what.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this has been done before, but I think we should outline our anxieties about the election in chronological order.
We're not going to be elucidating something that other people aren't going to do better. I highly recommend the New York Times and 538 have some really great videos and articles about this type of stuff. Highly recommend you check those out.
Yes.
We are not going to cover something as well as that. I think what we're mostly going to focus on is what are some potential scenarios that could happen, and what are we personally worrying about, and how we think that those scenarios could impact the country, but also just our normal lives.
Mm-hmm. The first major problem is there's going to be a lot of there has been a lot of misinformation, much of it coming from the White House, and there will continue to be a lot of misinformation on Election Day.
Yeah, and that is a result both of not making a political statement, just read Trump's Twitter. He has stated on multiple occasions that he thinks that there will be widespread fraud in this election, or that there already has been. And that is just simply not supported by the evidence.
No.
And so that is it's both, magnified by the fact that the current president is casting doubt on polling, casting doubt on absentee voting, and just casting doubt in the election in general. But it also comes from everyday people, both
Yes.
from sharing things that, maybe they didn't do their due diligence on. It's easy to just point the finger at Trump and say he's the problem here. And I think that he is definitely exacerbating things. But there is a whole host of different issues that make this election concerning, which is even more concerning if it was just one person, if it was just Donald Trump casting doubt on this election. That would be bad, but it would be manageable. But there are threats from all directions, both real and imagined.
Yes, and I think there is a class of people online who tend to be older and who don't have a good grasp of what's real and what isn't on the internet. And unfortunately, one of those people happens to be in the White House. I think that it's not... Donald Trump is a symptom of the way we talk about politics online. He's not a cause of it.
Yeah. It's a reciprocating cycle.
It is, yes. That's what I'm trying to say. And I think that ultimately, it doesn't matter what our systems say. The president holds power because people believe they are the president. If everyone in America decided tomorrow, hey, you know what? We're going to elect the Queen of England president. That's wildly illegal. We didn't hold an election. You can't even vote for her. But if everyone in America decides the Queen of England is the president...
Might as well be.
I mean, who's going to tell us no, right? Right. And so, to some extent, misinformation, even if it never affects... Even if you're not hacking voting machines, sowing doubt in people's mind about the electoral process and who legitimately holds power is a significant way to influence the election.
Well, and even talking about someone like trying to hack into voting machines, it's pretty agreed upon, at least, by, it seems like, the intelligence community, that in the last election, presidential election, there was access by Russians to our election, like to the election, but the big but is it doesn't seem like they did anything.
No.
It seems like they had access. They had some level of access, but they did not change the election. They did not, rig it so that Trump won. That is not what happened. But they did have access. And what's concerning is that even if, a group, a country, Russia in this case is the buzzword, but it could come from all sorts of sources, whether inside of the U.S. or outside of it. Even if they gain access and don't change anything, or maybe only change a tiny, tiny amount of votes, you only have to change, even if you don't change the outcome of the election because of meddling with the vote count, that will seed a lot of doubt and uncertainty into the election process. Because if they've manipulated 0.1% of the vote, well, people are going to assume that they manipulated much, much more than that.
Yes, absolutely. And so ideally what would happen is people would listen to their local voting officials, people who are running the vote in municipalities in each county.
Yeah.
And that those people have information and they are going to tell the truth, I hope. Unfortunately, I think that's unlikely. I think there's going to be a lot of misinformation that people listen to on Election Day.
And it should be noted that in terms of, at least from I believe it was a New York Times video that I watched the other day, it seems like this election is going to be very secure in terms of having backups. In the last election, there were a lot of people voting, like using voting machines that were purely electronic. Once they made their vote, all it was ones and zeros, which is, of course, in some ways susceptible to electronic interference. But in this election, I believe it's up to over 95% of voters are using a system that leaves a paper trail, that in some ways creates a physical object that can then be physically recounted if there is a dispute. And that is in part because in the last election, this breach prompted a lot of changes that now required paper trails in voting machines, and also a lot of people are mail-in voting, which inherently comes with a paper trail.
Yes. In fact, mail-in voting is in some ways safer than voting by an electronic machine because you have that physical paper trail. You can always go back and count the pieces of paper. If there's a question of was this machine interfered with, you can't go back and un 1 and 0 the ones and zeros.
Yeah. No, and the nice thing is a lot of the voting machines now in use are basically you would fill out the exact same ballot you would fill out for a mail-in vote, and then you just scan it through a machine. And it counts it electronically so that counting is faster. But if there's a dispute, they retain the physical ballots. And so
that was what would happen on Election Day. In the 2000 election, on election night, Al Gore conceded, and then 24 hours later changed his mind. He said, actually, I don't concede. I want to keep counting. And over the next month, votes kept getting counted in Florida. And it came down to about 500 votes across the whole state. It was very contentious.
Which is wild, which is why you should vote, because it can actually come down, especially if you're in a swing state, like, it can matter. It does matter.
Absolutely. I mean, it took a month before the Supreme Court had to step in and make a ruling, which it's... The first half of the Supreme Court's ruling in 2000 was that the Supreme Court had the jurisdiction to make the ruling they were about to make.
Interesting. An interesting unilateral power grab, but...
I mean, the Supreme Court was founded by a Supreme Court decision saying we have power that everyone respected. Yeah. And so, to some extent, if people accept that the Supreme Court has power, yeah, they do.
And that could also always been changed in law.
Yes. And ultimately, Al Gore respected the Supreme Court, and that decision did largely decide the election.
I think the analogy I've heard is that Al Gore was a man who still had bullets who still had bullets to fire, but chose not to. He could have still fought, but he chose that it was better for the country if he just conceded. But he still had ammunition.
Yes.
That's not going to happen this time.
No, I think that it would be incredibly destructive of Joe Biden to foible like Al Gore did, to go back and forth, because that sows uncertainty and distrust. I'm really torn. I think that if it looks like Joe Biden won the election, but Donald Trump refuses to concede, is it better for the country for Joe Biden to concede the election even if he won, or is it better to fight it out to the bitter end, even if that means removing Donald Trump from the White House with the Secret Service?
Yeah.
Right? I don't know which is better for the country. I hope Joe Biden is thinking about these questions.
Yeah, and I think we have to consider this election, but also the precedents that we set. I'll say either candidate were to seemingly lose, and either without any evidence, if there's evidence, I'm all ears, but without any evidence, claim that there was massive voter fraud,
which there just is not,
or that the election was in some way rigged. If we as a country, no matter what political party this candidate is, if we as a country say that if you just make claims out of your ass and you make them loud enough, we'll just listen and give you power, that's a really dangerous precedent to set. And another dangerous precedent to set that isn't even really to do with the candidates themselves is, say, after the election, for one reason or another, there is massive unrest, and I think, no matter who is elected, even if Donald Trump was elected, which I do not want, and elected via vote, not via false claims about voter fraud, but
right.
he won the election, fair and square. If there was then massive protests in the streets and people, burning cars and stuff like that, or I shouldn't say protests, riots, because there is a distinction to be made there, and then we changed our mind, then Biden was the president, I think that would be extremely bad.
Absolutely.
Even though I would prefer Biden to be president, if we set the precedent that you can change the outcome of an election by burning enough buildings and shooting enough people, that is a really, really dangerous precedent to set. And so I would never want that. And that could happen for either side.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we've seen over this summer violent clashes between people of different political inclinations, not even over partisan issues, over the issues of police brutality and racial injustice in the United States. People have been shot and killed over that over this summer. And I think that when it is not just political but partisan, it's going to be even worse.
Yes.
And so I have been trying to think for myself, if there is an attempt by the loser of the election to unfairly win, or if the loser refuses to concede, there is indications from the political history of other countries that large protests often make a difference. If there's an attempted illegal or illegitimate power grab that is met by massive protest in the streets, it usually doesn't work.
Yeah, the best, I shouldn't say best, the most effective power grabs happen in the dark.
Yes, and what allows a coup to take place is when people freeze. In Poland, for example, they had what was called the Orange Revolution, where there was an attempted coup, a soft coup, by the loser of the election, and people turned out into the streets in droves and basically said, no, we're not going to allow that to happen. You lost the election, get out of here. And it preserved their democracy. And I think that in the United States, I've been thinking about, if someone tries to make an illegitimate power grab, it is important for me to go out and protest.
Yeah.
Even if I might fear for my life, because I think there will be violent counter-protesters.
Yeah.
And I will protest if Joe Biden unfairly tries to claim he won the election or refuses to concede.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll make a statement right here. I am voting for Joe Biden, but if he loses and then through violence or coercion tries to take office, I would protest against that.
Absolutely. And so I've been thinking, and I think that all Americans should be thinking about, what am I going to do if, somebody tries political shenanigans?
Yeah. And I think that's all, in terms of, that's something you should be thinking about, and that we're certainly thinking about in terms of, your responsibilities as a citizen, but also your responsibilities in not even thinking about politics. Maybe it would be a good idea to have a couple weeks of food and water.
Yes.
James and I both have an inclination towards preparedness. And I think in our lifetimes, 1 week from today might be the riskiest day for something going wrong, or at least something happening in the next 6 months.
Yes.
In terms of our lifetime, because we've got a pandemic, a contested election, and I think something going bad is not going to be one incident on its own. It's going to be a combination of factors. It's going to be that we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is, directly problematic and has many, many knock-on effects. It's going to be that the election is going to just run slower and in some ways different and more risky because so many people are voting by mail and states are just not ready for that. I think, and from the evidence, it seems that mail-in voting is secure.
Yes.
But it is going to take longer, and there is a chance that just a truckload of ballots could just get lost. I think it's unlikely, but it is possible.
That would be very bad. And I think another thing that's worth pointing out is more people are voting in this election than ever before, and it's going to take a lot of time to count all of those paper ballots. Donald Trump keeps saying we need to know who wins on election night.
We won't. We won't.
We won't.
We can have a very good inclination, especially if, Biden wins a couple specific states. It could be like that count their votes much faster or are mostly in person. We get to a point where it's like, all right, it's 99.999 to 0.001.
Right. But Americans are used to having a spectacle at midnight on election night, and hey, we know who wins.
Yeah, it's the Super Bowl of politics.
That's not going to happen this year. When in reality, we don't need to know who wins for a whole month, and it might take us a week to count all the ballots. A number of Republican pundits have pointed out that you cannot both spend weeks counting every last ballot and deliver results that Americans want on election night.
True.
They have used... It is true.
Yeah, but I would argue counting every vote there's a key word there. Delivering results Americans want. Like, true. I wholeheartedly agree with that sentiment. People are going to want their results on election night.
They can't have them.
Yeah, you know what? Like, if I was talking to my doctor, right? And they were going to do, like, a screening for cancer or some sort of blood disease or something, right? And they're like, okay, so you've got two options, right? We're going to do this test, right? And either in an hour, I can tell you a result that you're probably going to like. There's a good chance you're going to like it. But there's it's probably wrong. Like, there's a good... it might be right. There's a chance it's right, but there's a good chance it's wrong. Or you can wait a week, and I'll tell you the real result. There's no way in hell I'm taking the result in an hour.
No. And these same Republican pundits who pointed that out, it is true. Americans are more likely to trust a result that comes out on election night than one that comes out a week later. Those same Republican pundits have used that to argue that, therefore, we should not count election ballots past election night. You count as much as you can on the day of the election, and then that's it. You don't count the rest of them, which is absurd. Americans want a result on election night. They don't get it. Too bad.
Yeah, like, bummer.
I think that a year from now, America will still have a democracy, but it will probably be a lot worse than our current democracy. There are going to have, it is unlikely that we get through election night without having to sacrifice something for peace and stability. Whether that is we have to sacrifice a totally accurate count of the ballots, or we have to sacrifice the impartiality of the judicial branch, or some intangible but valuable aspect of our democracy, I think it's going to we're going to lose one over the next 3 months of fighting about this election in order to keep peace and stability.
Yeah. I think in the long term, the biggest risk to democracy, to the well-being of the United States, is division inside of itself. But
absolutely,
something that could exacerbate that is interference in some way. If I were a foreign power, the next 2 months would look like a great time to try and make a move against the United States, or make a move abroad while the United States is distracted.
Absolutely. A lot of bad things could happen in this upcoming election. One of the ones that I am more concerned about is what happened in the election of 1876.
I don't know the election of 1866 off my head, so I'll have to explain.
So about 100 years after America was founded, after the Declaration of Independence, there was an election between this. So the Civil War happened. Lincoln served for 5 years, commander-in-chief, got us through the Civil War. He was assassinated. Ulysses S. Grant, general of the Union Army, took over as president after Lincoln's vice president had a really awful term as president. He did a very bad job as president. Ulysses S. Grant was president for 8 years. At the end of Ulysses S. Grant's second term, the Republican and Democratic candidates were going up against each other, and it was a very close election. Republican candidates wanted to continue with post-Civil War Reconstruction. They still had not yet followed through on their promise of 40 acres and a mule for every freed slave. There was still significant violence and division in the southern states. The southern states still had military occupation by the United States government 12 years later, because there were still lots of serious problems. And the election was held, and the Republican candidate to continue Reconstruction won the election. I believe it was Rutherford B. Hayes, but I'm not sure of that. So a number of southern states, which were won by the Republican candidate, had state legislatures controlled by white Democrats. And the white Democrats in these southern state legislatures did not like that black voters had chosen the Republican candidate. So the state legislatures decided to ignore the popular vote of their state and instead send electoral college electors for the Democratic candidate. The governors of these southern states were Republican and had been voted in by black voters, and sent electoral college electors for the Republican candidate. So this came to a head on January 6th. The House of Representatives opened up the electoral college votes, and they had 2 copies from a number of southern states, one for the Republican candidate and one for the Democratic candidate. Who do you listen to? And there was a huge mess in the Senate because racist white Southerners did not want the Republican candidate to be elected to continue Reconstruction. And it didn't matter that the way they had chosen the electors was illegitimate and that they had ignored the votes of black people. They were not going to allow that to happen. They weren't going to allow a Republican president. Eventually, the compromise... This was 2 days before Inauguration Day. President Ulysses S. Grant had threatened to declare martial law, extend his term, and send the military into the South in force. Things were very bad. The crisis was averted because Republicans and Democrats in the United States Congress came to a deal. The Republican candidate would be allowed to win the election, as he had legitimately won the election, and in exchange, Reconstruction would be ended. I
don't like playing with elections as a political move.
The Republican president who was elected decided to remove federal troops from the South. He ceased overseeing their elections, and what was left was 100 years of Jim Crow enforced on the African Americans in the South. Their election rights, which they'd had for about 12 years at that point, since the end of the Civil War, were rather quickly taken away from them. And it averted a second Civil War, but it also doomed African Americans to 100 years of Jim Crow. It's hard for me to measure that. Was that a legitimate...
What was the right call there?
Yeah, what was the right call?
And of course, times have changed a lot. The idea that this could happen isn't ridiculous. There are many people besides us, political analysts, journalists, experts, people in the field, who fear that this same thing could happen.
For example, the Republican Party in Pennsylvania has drawn up plans to send electors for Donald Trump from the state of Pennsylvania, whether he wins the popular vote or not, because they claim they are representing the will of the people, and the people of Pennsylvania want Donald Trump to be elected. And it's not just Pennsylvania. It was confirmed that it happened in Pennsylvania. It is rumored to have happened in other states.
Yeah. And we really get into the weeds because with Pennsylvania, right? Say Biden is elected in Pennsylvania, which is not certain, but is very, very possible. Say Biden is elected in Pennsylvania, or by the popular vote in Pennsylvania. By election, there's a set of electors that, cast their vote for Biden. And let's say that Pennsylvania's legislators decide that no, either because they just don't think that that's the will of the people in Pennsylvania, or maybe President Trump has said that there was massive voter fraud in Pennsylvania, with or without evidence, and that without that voter fraud, he would have won. Through some convoluted justification, they send their electors to cast a vote for Trump. Now, when the votes are counted in the joint in Congress, that is overseen by Vice President Mike Pence, and there is not a clear distinction of when there is conflicting votes, when there are two sets of votes from one state, who makes that call? Now, there's some thought that, or there is precedent, that the votes that have the approval of the governor of that state are the votes that are counted. And in Pennsylvania's case, their governor is a Democrat, so would most probably...
Yes. Be votes against Mike Pence.
Yeah.
Yes.
And there, some people argue, well, no, it is up to the vice president to decide what votes are counted, because they're the ones counting the vote, and so they can just count the ones they want, or they can just keep counting. They can just count. And it seems, no matter what your political party is, I think in the values that America has, it is concerning if there's ever a situation where in some way someone can unilaterally reelect themselves.
Yes.
Because Mike Pence, if he got to be the one to decide, if that scenario happened, which it is not guaranteed it will happen, I think it is unlikely that it will, but it is a real possibility. If in that scenario, the power was given to Mike Pence and Mike Pence alone to make the decision of which votes to count, there's no doubt in my mind he would pick the votes that, re-elect him. I mean, if he didn't, that would be, one for the history books, but I think that it's very unlikely, and I think any position where you give someone the sole power to re-elect themselves, it's just really, really bad.
Yes, and I'd also like to add, this isn't just some far-fetched thing that happened back in 1876. This happened in 2000, the 2000 election. The Democratic Party of Florida had made electoral college electors are due on December the 13th, I believe. They are usually elected on the 6th, but they're due on the 13th.
I believe it's December 14th.
14th, thank you. On December 4th of 2000, the Democratic Party of Florida had made plans to rent out a convention center and set up an election to elect electoral college electors in favor of Al Gore, regardless of what the governor of Florida, who I believe was Jeb Bush, future President Bush's cousin.
I will quick jump in here and say that at least in 2020, December 8th, there's a deadline called the Safe Harbor deadline under the Electoral Count Act, I'm reading from Wikipedia, where states must finally resolve any controversies over the selection of their electors of the Electoral College. And then on December 14th, the electors meet in their representative state capitals to formally vote. So they formally vote on the 14th, but they're really, really supposed to have that decision made on the 8th.
Yes. So in the 2000 election, it was 2 days before what you call the Safe Harbor deadline, when you need to choose your electors. And it was still a little unclear because the Supreme Court had not yet ruled. They would do so that evening. And the Democratic Party of Florida was all set up to send electors in favor of Al Gore, whether it was legitimate or not. They said, you know what, we're going to send electors for Al Gore because we think Al Gore won, and we're the Democratic Party. And so they had begun renting out a convention center and tapping delegates to vote and all of that jazz. In the end, the crisis was averted because the Supreme Court made a ruling 2 days before the electors were due, and Al Gore conceded. It doesn't really matter who won Florida if Al Gore himself says, I didn't win Florida. And so, in that case, there was no contention, there's no problem. But if Al Gore had not conceded, that could have been a serious problem. This isn't something far-fetched that just happened back in 1876. This has implications today.
And I think that, comparing it to 2000 is very good, but I think we're in a worse place than we are then, because we have gotten much more wrapped up into identity and morality politics versus just policy. It certainly was around in 2000, but it's not that I don't think, it's fairly obvious to anyone paying attention to the news or to anything that we are much more violently opposed to each other in this country than we were 2 years ago, than we were 4 years ago.
In 2000, Al Gore could sit down with George Bush and say, hey, good race, you won. There wasn't a lot of hatred or contention. Al Gore recognized some civility, some common values between the two of them. That's not going to happen this year. Both
candidates, I think specifically of Trump, but I am, of course, biased in my thought. And from what I've seen and what I've heard, both candidates have people violently in support of them that they could appeal to.
Yes.
I am sure that if either one of them asked people to incite violence in their name, they would both get a response.
Yes, absolutely.
And while I think both of them have that power, I think Donald Trump is much more likely to use it just because of his track record of being more tolerant of his supporters' violence.
Yeah. Even in the 2000 election, there was a group of angry, violent protesters outside of the ballot counting locations that interrupted ballot counting a few times. And that was back in 2000. American politics were much less violent and contentious then.
What if instead of a group of people protesting a polling site, people stormed it and burned the ballots? What do you do?
Right.
Especially if that's in a swing state, especially if those ballots could have held the election in the balance.
Serious problems.
And I think that is unlikely. Again, I think it's very unlikely. But I think that it is possible for either side. I think it is possible that there are people violently on either side that if they saw the election going poorly as the votes start coming in, maybe they decide they need to take it into their own action and physically destroy the ballot so that, well, it can't get any worse from now. We just have to go with what we've got. And I think that's unlikely, but I don't think it's impossible.
No. There's a type of logical fallacy called a false appeal to moderation, that if you have two extremes, clearly the middle is the right answer, which is not, it's a fallacy. I think that's the wrong way of thinking. Donald Trump has personally called on his followers to
watch the polls,
incite to be intimidating violent forces at voting locations. Joe Biden has not done that, and so I think that it is. I don't particularly like Joe Biden, and I can see many things that Trump has done well as president, even though I'm voting for Joe Biden. But I think it is fair to call a spade and say that Donald Trump is intentionally inciting that kind of violence from his supporters.
And this is part of the reason why some people like him, is that he is boisterous and flashy and not willing to back down. And for some people, that kind of attitude is exactly what they want in a president. But I think especially right now, it's very dangerous. I'm trying to think of any situation where I've been like, wow, he really de-escalated things there. Donald Trump will stoke things up. And the reason why I believe that isn't because of my distaste for him. It's because of his track record. He has demonstrated time and time again, and not through some shady article, but through his own Twitter and his own quotes.
Yes.
That he is willing to call into question election and poll results without any evidence.
He did it in 2016 when he won.
I know. Like, if we're at the point where when he won the Electoral College, he was claiming that there was massive voter fraud. What is he going to do if he loses?
Yeah. Which it currently looks like he will.
Yeah, I pulled up before we started recording the 538 website, which is, if any of y'all haven't checked out 538, beautiful.
And why have you been living under a rock?
Yeah, they do an aggregate of polls and run simulations. And right now, as of October 27th, they have Biden favored 88% of the time to 12% of the time for a win.
So that doesn't mean Joe Biden will win. That means it is more likely that Joe Biden wins by 88 to 12.
Yeah, in the same way that last time around, Hillary Clinton was favored to win, and she didn't. There were some whack things going on, and some of the polling practices are better. So it is worthwhile to look at the polls. They're not perfect, but they're still valuable to look at.
Yes. And to some extent, it's a poll with margins of error because it is a guess.
Yeah.
There is uncertainty in the future, and why did Donald Trump win in 2016? He got lucky. I think we should pivot now and talk about personal experiences with the election. What have we experienced? What are we thinking about? What have our friends done? I think one notable personal experience we have upcoming in this election is poll workers. I know a lot of young people who signed up as poll workers, which is usually not the case, but in the midst of a pandemic, many of the poll workers, which were retirees volunteering, are no longer working the poll because of health risks. And there's been a massive push for young people to step up and help out. I signed up to work as a poll worker in my hometown, and I have not heard back from them 2 months later. They are just swamped trying to shift and run an election during a pandemic and find all new poll workers, and all the old poll workers aren't coming back, and there's a whole bunch of new people signing up, and so they're swamped, they're overloaded. I don't think I'm going to be able to work as a poll worker during this election, which is unfortunate. I should have been more proactive about that. But a lot of young people are signing up to work as poll workers and participating in politics for the first time.
Yeah.
There's also a large surge in voter registration and voting by young people. All of our friends who I've talked to are voting.
Almost everyone I've talked to at least has said they're going to vote. People might say that because they'd be embarrassed not to, but I don't know if that's always the case. And maybe that's because of the type of people we surround ourselves with, that they take that as a responsibility. But I know that, on campus, a massive, massive push just to get people to vote.
That is, one significant thing is more young people are involved in politics this election. I certainly don't think the election's going to go well, but I don't know. For whatever reason, I'm not feeling the same anxiety. I think that 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency have been destructive, but 4 more years of Donald Trump's presidency won't destroy America, and 4 years of Joe Biden's presidency won't fix everything.
Yeah.
The election is important, but the election is not existential.
My anxiety, of course, I don't want Trump to win. I think he's bad for our country, but that is not where my main anxiety lies. My main anxiety lies in what we talked about, when we have a questioned election.
Yes.
Because I think that's what has the real potential to damage democracy, not either one of the candidates. And also in terms of thinking about, whatever candidate is elected, some context that came up in a discussion I was having with someone that I don't know what to do with. They asked, how is this going to affect you if Trump wins? And I was like, well, not much.
Yeah.
In terms of my life, how my personal life will change, whoever is elected, not really. I'm fairly privileged. I've got money in the bank to pay for college. I'm a white guy.
Mm-hmm.
The stakes here are not, of course I will be affected in some ways, but when I'm older and maybe have more, more impact on my finances or my insurance or stuff like that, yeah, maybe it'll impact me. So that calms me in some ways, but in ways that I feel guilty about, in that,
yeah.
I know that I'm going to be okay. I think the future that I have imagined for myself that I want, unless shit really goes down and, democracy starts to fail, it's probably going to be fine for me. I'm going to do fine. It's other people I worry about. And I don't want to lean too much into just going zen because I'm going to be fine, because I think that's how, marginalized people get screwed, is if people who have privilege stop caring.
Absolutely. Recently, this is going to feel like a bit of a hard pivot for some of our audience, but it makes sense in my mind. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about the Christian political worldview. Paul writes in Romans that Christians should submit to the governing authorities. Peter says the same thing in his letter, 1 Peter. Jesus was subservient to the political institutions of his day. And the rationale behind all of it is that the real power and the real authority in the universe does not belong to human political institutions. And so as Christians, we understand that human political institutions, although they hold power, it is a power that is derivative, that has been given to them by God. And so Christians are to work for the good of the political spaces they find themselves in, and they are to respect and serve those political authorities because they've been put in place by God. But Christians are not to mistake those political authorities with the ultimate authority in the universe. I've been spending a lot of time over the last few weeks thinking about that, and it's been calming for me to remember that, as a Christian, the ultimate source of authority in the universe isn't the United States government. Sooner or later, the United States government is going to fail. No human political institution lasts forever. But I have something much more secure that I'm founded in.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I have been able to avoid a lot of the anxiety. That same impetus, that same knowledge that political institutions are under the authority of God has driven me to work very hard for the benefit of the political institutions I serve in. God tells his people, work for the good of the city I've put you in. Take care of the people around you.
Yeah.
And so I should absolutely work for the good of democracy in America, but I'm not doing it because I want to serve the good of democracy in America. I do it because I serve God.
Yeah, democracy is a tool. It's not a...
It's not an end in itself, right? And so, surprisingly, I found myself, even when I think about the collapse of democracy, I'm not as anxious as I would have been 6 months ago.
Surprisingly zen about the collapse of democracy. Now there's an episode title and a half.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably weird for you to hear me say that. It's very weird for me to experience it, that I'm so zen about the collapse of democracy. But I think that a Christian worldview has given me a perspective of seeing that human political institutions are not an end in themselves. They're not eternal. They don't hold ultimate power. So I guess that's where I'm drawing my comfort from as the election approaches.
Nice. Oh, yeah. And I don't know. I think we've mentioned this before. I don't know. But the constant swing between, or, is this an overreaction or is this normalcy biased?
Oh, absolutely. Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings. A lot of people are mad at him for using the eagles to solve problems. Yeah. You write yourself into a corner, boom, the eagles swoop in and fix things. But Tolkien did that very intentionally. He has a concept he calls a eutastrophe, which is the Greek eu, meaning good, like euphoria, mixed with catastrophe, something unexpected and sudden and bad. A eutastrophe is something good that happens unexpectedly. Unexpectedly, all your problems fix themselves. And Tolkien wrote a lot about this idea of eutastrophe, and he never says the word in his books, but it's clearly in his mind when he's writing them. And so I think that I've been reflecting on Tolkien's idea of eutastrophe, and for him it also comes from a place of faith, that God broke into history and caused eutastrophe, and that's what he's all about. And so, yeah, there are a lot of ways this election could go very badly, but I've also been trying to be intentional about thinking about potential eutastrophes, right? What is a way that this election could go really well? What are all of the possible things that could go right in this election?
I think the eutastrophe, I suppose, that I have thought about is maybe if it, how poorly it goes will expose how divided as a country we are and will lead to a shift of hey, we gotta focus on what matters, and that's being a country that can talk to each other and can care about each other no matter what we think.
Yeah, that's absolutely a possibility. Another thing that I've seen as a good outcome of this election, so many more people are informed and involved in politics, which has been a long problem in American society. Maybe we see a eutastrophe where there's a clear election landslide because
more people are voting.
So many more people vote. Yeah, I think that would be an example of a eutastrophe.
Cross our fingers.
We'll see. But I think that's another way that I've been combating election anxiety, is trying to think about all the ways the election could go really well.
Yeah. All right. Thank you guys for listening. I think we're going to wrap this one up right here. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and that it didn't stoke too many of your own anxieties. If you live in the United States and you are eligible to vote, please do. if you are listening to this the morning of the election day and you have not voted and you can do that today, do it. Stop listening. Go vote right now. For everybody else, think about these things and be ready for whatever might happen, because there's a lot that could change in this upcoming election. And whether that means thinking about at what point you think you would have to participate in political advocacy, or if it means stocking up on food for the next 2 weeks.
Yes. We've been surprisingly touched to see how many people are listening to our podcast. I expected to have no listeners, and as of this recording, we have nearly 100, I believe.
100 total listens.
Yes. Yes, thank you. And so I want to thank all of our audience for that, and wish you safety and security over the next 3 contentious months. Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we'd like to invite you to send in questions. We will answer them on our podcast. There's a lot of you, and we'd love to have all of your questions.
And a special note, I know that some of our listeners are not from the U.S., and so if you listen to this episode, great. I think it was worthwhile for us to cover, both because it's on our own minds, and also because at this point, no matter where you live in the world, the United States impacts you. So if you listen to this and you don't live in the United States, thanks for listening. I hope things are better where you are.
And send in a question anyways. We'll be happy to answer your questions too. I think that's all for this week. I'm James.
And I'm Noah. Bye.
Do we have an outro yet?
No,
We still don't have an outro.
We still don't have an outro.